everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty, and today I'm going to be crafting and showing you how I created a fun little primitive style black cat with a little ghosty pal inside of a pocket. Now I'm very much a beginner sewer and I'm just learning about stitching, and I'm hoping to show you that even with some basic skills you can create this cute little character. Today I'm a part of a YouTube collaboration called It's Always Halloween. We have two hosts today. We have Dawn with Shabby Meets Bling and Monica with Up All Night DIY. Plus, we have a surprise guest host today, and all the links to their channels will be listed down in the description box, as well as a playlist for all the rest of the creators who've joined in on today's fun collaboration of Halloween ideas. Well, let's get started. I can't wait to show you this little sweet little black cat and his cute little ghosty friend. My first step was to create a pattern. I do have this pattern listed for sale on my Ko-fi page, and the link is in the description box if you would like to purchase it. I printed my pattern pieces out onto cardstock, cut them out, and then traced them on to a double layer of muslin using a friction pin. Friction pins easily disappear with heat, so you can either use an iron or a heat tool to go ahead and erase your lines. Since my pattern is traced on a double layer of muslin, I need to pin my pieces together before I were to cut them out. The line that I drew is actually going to be the line that I sew on, and I'm going to be making a rough cut around my pattern pieces. Once I have my pieces all cut out, I'm going to be taking it to my sewing machine. To sew my pieces together, I use a straight stitch on my sewing machine, and I like using the smallest stitch I have available. By using the smallest stitch, I'm able to turn corners a lot easier. These pieces are going to have stuffing in them, so you need to leave that opening at the bottom to be able to put the stuffing in. You want to make sure you're back stitching at those bottom areas to lock your stitches in place and to make sure your piece will stay closed. I use my embossing tool to erase the lines, and then I cut a seam allowance all the way around my pattern piece. I only need about 1/4 inch all the way around, and once I have this seam allowance all the way around my item, I'm going to take my scissors and do a little nip pattern all the way around, and this will help my seams to lay a lot flatter. When cutting the nips, you want to make sure you're not getting too close to your sewn lines. If you do happen to accidentally cut through your piece where you've sewn, take it back to your sewing machine and go ahead and re-sew that area. The little nipped areas will really help your pieces lay flat, especially in those tight sewn areas. So definitely take some time and do those little nips all the way around your pieces. Once you have your pieces all nipped and ready to turn to the right side, go ahead and turn all your fabric pieces the right side out. I'm using a turning tool here. It's basically a plastic tool and a wooden stick, and you'll basically slide the pieces up and over each other to turn your pieces to the right side out. This tool really does help with these small little pieces. I use that wooden piece to go ahead and pop my corners and really flatten out the seams. It's especially helpful in those little ears, and then also making those back areas where the seams are, just to get my form a lot better. To do the top part of my hat, which is the band, I go ahead and I cut a little seam right at the top. I don't want it to go all the way through this piece, only one layer. So I fold the fabric and then cut a little slit at the top. I also turn that piece the right side out. Now it's time to go ahead and add the polyfill, since all my pieces are turned the right side out. This tool, the hemostat tool, is really helpful in filling these small pieces. You can buy these at a bait and fish store. These are great for like removing hooks from a fish mouth, but they work great for putting that stuffing into those small pieces. For my larger pieces, especially the cat, I want to give my piece a nice massage to make sure that my polyfill is laying smoothly. I can also take this time now and see where I need to add more stuffing, push up against the seams to make them a lot more smoother in the end. The hemostat tool works really great too for pushing that stuffing up into the point of the hat. For the brim of my hat, I wanted it to poke over to the top of my ears of my cat. So I eyeballed it, created a slit, slid my ear through that one, and then I held the fabric down between the ears and then eyeballed the second one and created another slit. You want to start a little small, and then you can always make them bigger. Start small and then clip a little larger if you need to. I wanted to have that brim piece lay fairly flat, so I also ironed it on my iron to make my piece nice and flat. I did go ahead and sew that piece together at the bottom and close that up. To add some weight to my piece, I took these glassette beads and made a pillow and filled my pillow with the glassettes. You definitely want to make sure you have something underneath you when you're pouring this out because these things can go everywhere. But I created this little pillow and it's going to go in the bottom of my cat to give it a little weight, and I'm going to go ahead and sew the bottom together. Now to sew the top part of my hat onto the brim, it worked the easiest I found was to go ahead and sit it down and then make a tack, a little bit of a knot on the one side, go across that piece and then make another knot on that one, and then make a knot on the front and on the back as well. So all 4 areas were tacked down and they weren't going to slide around anymore. Then once I had them tacked, I just went ahead and used a simple little whip stitch back and forth and sewed my hat pieces together. As I was stitching around my hat, I used my needle and I tucked the fabric under and then created those little whip stitches all the way around my hat. Stitching my hat made sure it was going to be together securely, much easier than trying to glue it. The glue would most likely melt the polyfill, so the stitching is what I wanted to do. For my hat, I wanted to create a rustic texture, so first I used some spray paint and heavily sprayed it, and then I used cinnamon and thoroughly covered my hat with a lot of cinnamon. I was going to let this dry for several hours and then use a paintbrush to remove the cinnamon. This creates a great rustic texture. To add the color to my cat, I'm going to be using an acrylic paint in the color Lamp Black. First I take the paint and then I want to water it down a little bit. By adding the water, it's going to glide across my fabric so much easier, plus I don't get such a thick bit of paint on there. I want to be able to stitch this piece, and if I have too thick of a layer of acrylic paint, I just have a really hard time getting my needle through my piece. When you're putting on your paint, you want to make sure you're getting your edges where you've sewn so that you cover the white thread or any type of thread you might have used to stitch your pieces together. Once my pieces have been all the way painted, I went ahead and I took my heat tool and I dried my piece. Once the piece is dried, I take some 220 grit sandpaper and give my piece a light sanding. You can feel on your fabric that the fibers are lightly raised, so this helps smooth your piece down. So once I have done all my sanding, I go ahead and do round number 2 and then go ahead and do another sanding after my piece is dry. Now it's time to go ahead and assemble my pieces, and I start by sewing on my tail. This part is a little bit tricky and a little difficult to get my needle through because there's 2 seams there, one where I sewn my tail together and one where I had stitched the cat. So I do end up using a little bit of help from my table. I went ahead and I would put my needle in partially and then push it down on my table to get that needle to go all the way through. Having a thimble, a nice hard thimble, would be very helpful to do this project. To create the nose for my cat, I wanted to use a different fabric texture. I had purchased this suit from my thrift store and I thought the fabric would look great to create an interesting nose. I cut it into a triangle shape and I was going to be sewing it onto this little kitty's face. I was going to be hot gluing some buttons on for his eyes and hot gluing a button on his tail as well. But before I did any of that, I wanted to add a layer of coffee stain to my piece. So I used some instant coffee, about a half a cup of water with about 2 tablespoons of instant coffee, applied the stain all over and gave it a dry with my heat tool. I had noticed some other images on Pinterest of some primitive items where they add an eyelid to their little creatures, and I love that idea. So I used some kitchen towel that had been already coffee stained, and I created little half circles and I ripped the one edge. I thought the ripped edge kind of looked like eyelashes, and I really liked that look. So once I had placed it down with a little bit of glue to try to hold it down, I used a random stitch around the eye. Once I had the eyelid on, I used a little bit of stuffing to pop up into that area just to give it even a little bit more form. I really do like the look of this eyelid look, and those little eyelashes just kind of made me giggle. Once I had both of the eyelids on, I decided to add a little bit of coffee stain to the tops of them. I first sprayed them with water so the coffee wouldn't soak in too hard, but it was enough contrast to kind of make that little eyelid look a little bit more primitive and not so light. I decided to use a little tacky glue on top of the button areas to make sure that the eyebrow area would stay down and it wouldn't flip up by accident to see any of the polyfill. I used a wooden skewer to put the glue on, and that worked pretty well. To create the muzzle for my kitty, I was going to be using some of Aunt Lydia's crochet thread to create the muzzle. I used a doll needle from the back and I went through to the center of my nose. Held my string off to the side because I was going to be creating a V shape. Took a stitch underneath to the other side. This was going to be the bottom side of that V. Once I had my stitch there, I went to the middle and then came out through the back, the same hole I came in through. I was going to be tying a knot in the back to finish it off. This is just a simple little muzzle look, but I thought it looked pretty cute on this little kitty. And it's a real easy stitch to make with that doll needle. Up next was to create some whiskers, and I was going to be using some more of the Aunt Lydia crochet thread to be able to create this look as well. I take a length and then I went ahead and I tied a knot. Once I had the knot on the end, that was going to be the left side of my whisker. I went ahead and I ran the thread through my needle. And I went to the one side of the nose, put it underneath the nose, and out the other side. And where the knot is, that's where that whisker was going to stop. Once I had the needle all the way through, I went ahead and I cut my thread and then pulled the thread out on the other side. I was going to be creating a knot on this side as well. I use the needle to help me get that knot nice and close. I go ahead and I tie my loop like I'm going to tie a knot. Take my needle and put it inside of that area and hold the needle down where I want my final knot to be. And then that thread will pull as tight up to my needle as can be and creates a nice little stopping point for my knot. I go ahead and I create 3 more whiskers or 2 more whiskers on each side, and I make them in a triangle pattern for each side. Once I have them where I want them, I go ahead and I trim them off to the length I needed. I decided a little coffee stain would look good on these too, so I took some coffee stain and added it on there, spritzed them with a little bit of water, and then took a paper towel and kind of dabbed them so they didn't get too dark. I didn't want them to have a really dark look in the end, but just a little bit of antiquing I thought would look nice to this, add to that primitive look of this kitty. To add yet another layer of cuteness to this little guy, I decided I wanted to add some rusty colored cheeks to my kitty. So I folded his whiskers up and then took some matte medium and created round circles on his cheeks. I wanted to use matte medium because it dries very flat, no sheen at all. Once I had the glue on, I took a stipple brush and I stippled on some cinnamon, just pouncing up and down and creating those little cinnamon circles on his face. I did give it a dry and then applied another layer, just to make sure I had enough cinnamon on there and I could see it in the end. I love the way these little rusty cheeks look. Now for the hat, I went ahead and I took a little stiff brush and I went ahead and I brushed that extra bit of cinnamon off. And it creates a great look. That paint underneath absorbs the cinnamon and it creates kind of a rustic texture to that hat. I applied some hot glue in the middle, pressed it down, poked my ears through the top, and held it until the glue dried. Now to go ahead and create that cute little pocket for his little ghosty pal. I have 2 layers of fabric. One's a tea-stained or a coffee-stained piece of dishcloth, and the other's just a little piece of canvas underneath. And I just used some random bits of fabric and lace to create a texture on the top of the pocket. I used some slow stitching patterns to hold my fabric in place. For the lace, I created some X's, and on the next piece of fabric, I just do a series of straight stitches all the way around, and I also do some slow stitching letters. To create the little ghosty guys, I used some drop cloth fabric to create him out of, just to change up the texture a little bit more. I create in the same way, tracing around my pattern, going ahead and sewing it, and then turning him the right side out. To get that little tip of his hat to be pulled all the way out, I ended up using a stylus tool to go into that little tippy part of his hat and pull it out to the point. I was going to be adding some stuffing to this guy, but not a lot, just enough to puff him up, to add a little bit of depth to him, but not a whole lot. I placed him down and used my friction pen to draw his face. I did 2 eyes and a mouth. The stitch I was going to be using to create the eyes and mouth with is called a satin stitch. I was going to be using 3 strands of black DMC thread to create this stitch with. It is nice, that little hemostat tool does lock, so you can put your stuffing in there, lock it, and then you can use 2 hands if you need to be able to pull it over your piece, and it still stays locked. It's kind of handy that way. I used that sharp tool to make sure I had enough stuffing in the very tip and push that stuffing up into there. To do these eyes, I was going to be using the satin stitch. So you started from the bottom, or I started from the bottom, and then went to the top and then made a stitch all the way down to the bottom. Come to the top again and go all the way down to the bottom. I'm not going all the way through my piece, I'm only going through that top layer of fabric. If you don't get your stitches all the way touched, you can go back through and add another layer of stitches if you need to. And I was just using some DMC embroidery floss to create the eyes and the nose for this little ghosty. Tied it off on the back and gave a knot a clip. Cute, right? Super cute. I laid him down and I was going to be using some hot glue to just glue my pocket on. And I did put a little bit of glue on the back of my ghost as well to make sure he stayed in and he wasn't going to fall out. You do need to hold the piece for a little bit and give your glue a chance to dry. But I think he's looking pretty darn cute. I know I say that word a lot, but that's what I do at Painting Crafty, is cute, cute, cute. To finish off his hat, I took a little bit of that kitchen towel, created a small band for the top by just ripping a piece of fabric. I had a little piece of leftover lace that I had used on the front of the pocket, added some stitches to that to make it kind of look like a rosette flower of some sort, and then just glued it to the top as a finishing touch. And we're just about done with this little fella. I wanted to look like a little bit like a pull toy, so I had these spools in my stash and I thought I would use those. I was going to hot glue them onto the bottom and then take a little bit of jute twine and run it through the spools to act like an axle or look like they were attached some way. And then create some sort of pull toy with a smaller bit of a spool and some more of the jute twine. Well, let's see what he looks like setting up on my porch. I wanted to say a special thank you to Dawn and Monica for hosting today's Halloween collaboration. Make sure you check out their channels inside of the description box, as well as click that playlist so you can see all of the other creative ideas shared today. If you're interested in the pattern, make sure to go over and check out my Ko-fi page. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today, and hopefully you'll come back and see me again. And next time you'll create right along with me.